critical issues. When you're making judicial appointments, it's very important that you get the right person. And given our times and what's going on in Washington with the Supreme Court, I think it's even more important. So I'm looking forward to the challenge, and I bring my background and experience. And it's a good fit. It's a good fit for Michael Albano.
Okay. The Governor's Council, it goes back to colonial times. There are still people every once in a while who say, do we even need it anymore? But it has purview over gubernatorial appointments to any number of state boards and commissions. But the most attention, I think, and feel free to disagree, comes on judicial appointments. The governor gets a recommendation from the Judicial Nominating Committee, sends it on, and it has to have approval of a majority of the 8 members of the Governor's Council. How critical is that, do you think?
Well, it's very critical. And if you look at the Supreme Judicial Court, for example, that passed, allowed for marriage equality, it only passed by 1 vote. It was a 4-3 vote of the SJC. So one of my goals is to make sure we don't go backwards. Judge Ireland, I'm told, may be leaving in the next 16 months, so that'll be a critical confirmation by the Governor's Council. I want to make sure we get it right and that we don't go back relative to marriage equality. We don't go back relative to affirmative action. We don't go backwards relative to a woman's right to choose. We don't go backwards relative to the death penalty. I don't think we're in jeopardy of that, but I want to make sure. I've worked pretty hard over my public service career implementing those policies. As a Governor's Council, I want to protect those policies. And given what's happened in Washington as recent as last night, it's very possible that some changes could be made on the federal level, which could impact the state level. So it's a legacy type of position as far as I'm concerned, to make sure that you get those appointments correct. And not just the judiciary, the Labor Relations Council, Commission, the Industrial Accident Board, the Unemployment Compensation Review Board. There are a number of boards and commissions that impact the lives daily of people. And I think that my values and the values of Western Massachusetts are consistent. So again, I'm looking forward to the challenge. I'm looking forward to working with Governor Patrick and whomever comes after him.
What are you going to look for? What's going to be some of Michael Albano's criterion for a judicial nominee to get your vote to be appointed?
Well, there is going to be a litmus test relative to the issues that I've outlined. And I'm not going to sit there and just be a rubber stamp for the governor. And I'm not going to let the nominees dance around the question as they do in Washington sometimes. Well, I don't have the case before me. I'm going to get a yes or no answer, not just for my satisfaction, but for the people I represent in the 4 counties here in Western Massachusetts. On another level, and people may disagree with me, but I'm going to look for activist judges, because what I've seen in my legislative experience being down in Boston, there's a lot of lawyer legislators. I don't dislike lawyers, I don't dislike legislators, but the combination together sometimes is not conducive to good public policy. So in some situations it may be essential that we have activist judges, because the legislature, for example, on the probate court, in my view, is just not getting the job done. So it's going to be a combination of things. I'm going to be seeing if they've done any pro bono work, free work for the people of the community, indigent people on criminal cases, housing, probate matters, hospice matters. I want to see what they've done, what they've contributed to the community for free as part of my consideration for confirmation.
You bring an interesting combination of experience to this candidacy. Mayor of Springfield, served on the city council. You also, you worked your day job. You were in the probation operations for the state a number of years. You were on the state parole board. And that took us to a very interesting place where paroles that were involved, some people who were convicted, and I think it's a nationally known case, it's famous, where you brought up problems and questions you saw with some convictions of people who were in prison for years. It turned out it was falsified information by the federal government, by the FBI and the federal folks. You've always said that's one of the reasons you were put through the ringer a lot of times in investigations by federal officials. There were supposed to be hearings. I don't think they ever happened, partially because they were scheduled right after 9/11, and the FBI said, we've got no time for any of this. But how does all that impact your thinking as you look to go into a job like this that has a critical impact on the judicial system?
Well, it's a very unique experience. I can tell you, and it's been an incredible journey for me going back to 1983, as I tried to release these 4 Italian Americans who were wrongfully convicted by the FBI. If you just bear with me for 1 second. The FBI knew in advance that someone was going to be murdered. They knew who was going to do it. They let the murder happen, Teddy Deegan, 1966. Then they framed 4 Italian Americans. with one of their informants, which is policy that still goes on today in America, even though it's not supposed to. They go to trial, they're convicted. Not only are they convicted of murder, but 3 out of the 4 get the death penalty. And the Supreme Court overturns that. And sooner or later, it came to the forefront that they were wrongfully convicted, and they're freed. In the meantime, I'm preparing testimony on this whole case before the United States Congress, the Committee on Government Reform and Oversight. And I get all the testimony going, and coincidentally, the investigation starts here in Springfield. Now, you may believe it's a coincidence. I don't. But when I did finally testify in the civil trial against the FBI in 2006 for the families of those who were wrongfully convicted, it was amazing that the Justice Department said, even though we had information that could exonerate these men and free them, this is exactly what they said. We had no responsibility to disclose that to the community, to the law enforcement officials. So they were prepared to let these men die on the electric chair. 2 of them, unfortunately, died in prison of natural causes. 2 were released. And when I testified, that's what they said. And fortunately for the families, if you can say that, they were awarded the biggest amount of money in the history of the country in a suit against the federal government. So I make no apologies for trying to release innocent men. I make no apologies. And, you know, I'll take the hit for it. I'll take it. And that's what goes in this business. And I'm very comfortable with what I've done over the last 20 years.
Yeah, your opponent wants to see what he calls recertification of judges. These could be every 4, every 6, every 7 years after someone's been appointed to the bench. He thinks they should, in some way or another, be evaluated by some independent group. The public looks at that, and then there's some sort of popular election, whether it's on election day or some way that they can. That's all to be worked out. But what do you think about that? I mean, there are those who say that threatens the independence of the judiciary. What's your take?
Oh, I think it'd be a terrible mistake to have elections of judges. With all the special interest money that's flowing around, just in this senatorial election here in Massachusetts and across the country, to have judges go out for election every 6 years or every 2 years, it just makes absolutely no sense. You can just see the Koch brothers getting involved in the election of the Supreme Judicial Court nominee here in Massachusetts and spending millions and millions of dollars to get their conservative right-wing cause essentially elected through that judicial position. I mean, that would be very, very dangerous. The process that we have now is fine. The governor gets elected, popular vote, makes the recommendation to the governor's council, and we confirm or deny. I'm satisfied with that. I think if you talk to any attorney across Massachusetts, they will agree. If you talk to any person who's objective about this, I think you want an independent judiciary. You don't want special interest money influencing anyone. And if you had to run for election as a judge, I think it'd be a serious error in public policy.
Are you comfortable that there is enough apparatus in place, if you will, procedures, that if a judge is in some way wrong, and I guess each one of us could define what we think of as wrong, but if a judge isn't getting the job done, there is a recourse to deal with that?
I'm not satisfied with the current system, and that's what I want to bring to the governor's council. I want people to feel comfortable that if they have a complaint against a judge, that they can come to Michael Albano from Western Massachusetts. So I'm not comfortable with the process because it's lawyers reviewing lawyers. So I'd like to have a process where the governor's council is involved in complaints and making sure that people get their due of justice and making sure that the complaint is properly heard and properly recorded and the appropriate action is taken. If it's disbarment, if it's some type of action of removal from the bench, I'd be comfortable with that kind of a process.
Got about a minute and a half left, and I get a little philosophical, and I suppose everything you've said up to now leads up to this in a way, but we have heard from time to time people say, look, it doesn't cost an awful lot of money, but the governor's council does require some state funding. There are some salaries, there are some support services, and it goes back to colonial times. Do we really need a governor's council anymore? I'm sure you think we do. You're running for it.
I can make the argument that you don't need it, but somebody has to do the confirmation. Now, in the federal government, it's the United States Senate, and you've seen the problems there where Congress is bottlenecked and judicial nominees do not move through the Senate Judiciary Committee. In Massachusetts, you could have the House do it or the Senate do it. But I believe that there's an inherent conflict there because the governor presents his or her budget, and the legislature responds. There's a check and balance. And if you throw in judicial nominees or Labor Relations Commission nominees into that process, I think it complicates it. And the last thing you want to have is horse trading relative to judicial appointments via, we'll get this bill for this judicial appointment. I think there's an inherent conflict of interest there because of the nature of the check and balances. So an 8-member council elected across the Commonwealth, I think makes more sense.
Michael Albano, candidate for Governor's Council on the Democratic side, thank you for being with us. We thank the Republican candidate, Mike Franco, for being with us earlier. The big thing is to remember to vote on November 6th. We'll see you next time on The State We're In.